On May 25, 2020, George Floyd was killed by police officers in Minneapolis after he was accused of using a fake $20 bill at a store. In the days and weeks that followed, protesters filled the streets in all 50 states and 60 other countries, sparking one of the biggest movements for police reform and racial justice in history.
I have a right to stop you because you're being suspicious.
We have seen so many videos of people either being brutalized or killed at the hands of law enforcement, but this tape was so egregious that it was the catalyst for protest in every single state, many countries around the world.
Justice for George Floyd looks like George Floyd actually being here. Like, there's nothing that a settlement can do, there's nothing that this guilty verdict can do to actually combat the fact that George Floyd is no longer here.
In the year since Floyd's death and the start of a historic protest movement, has policing in America changed? And how will history remember this moment?
You might be able to see on the other side of this intersection that massive crowd gathered here for this protest. People from all over Minneapolis showing up here to demonstrate tonight. I got a call 5-something in the morning. Hey, you need to get on a plane. You need to head over to Minneapolis. I quickly knew this was going to be a monumental story.
After an encounter with officers outside of a store in Minneapolis, George Floyd was killed by then-Officer Derek Chauvin on May 25, 2020.
Please, man. You got an ID on you?
A video showing the murder, filmed by a witness, was posted to Facebook the next day. The video quickly spread across social media. By that evening, protesters began taking to the streets in Minneapolis.
That video really allowed the world to observe that moment. It's 10 minutes. You know, it's not something where it's a kind of instant, somebody did something quickly and it all feels very accidental. It's incredibly deliberate.
No, bro, look at him. He's not responsive right now, bro.
I didn't know what to do at the moment. You know, it was like unreal. You know, you see this happen in front of you, you know, and it's a murder, you know, and what do? You call the police if you witness a murder. And I called the police on the police because I witnessed a murder.
I think after last May, where we saw the tragic end to George Floyd's life, we were all in law enforcement very upset by it and repulsed, as most people were. We were stained across the country as being Derek Chauvin, and we're not. We're not anywhere close to that. People tell me that, you know, different things. I helped deliver children. I took people to the hospital. You know, I comforted victims of crime. I did all these things, and none of that just all out the window now with this.
Less than 24 hours after George Floyd dies, I'm on the ground there in Minneapolis, and you can feel the tension in the air. Usually you see a lot of these protests and demonstrations, and it's black people fighting for other black people. But here in this case, we saw people of all races and cultures taking to the streets and saying, you know what? I can't believe what I just saw. We have to do something about this.
George Floyd! George Floyd!
And in those moments, there was a lot of anger, but it didn't seem like anybody really had any solutions in that moment.
That's the precinct.
They wanted to express their anger, express how wrong this was, and that's why I think we saw people take to the streets in the way they did.
A year ago was my first time ever protesting or being this politically active. I have watched a lot of people that look like me die on video in the past decade. And at that moment, I watched that video and I knew George Floyd definitely deserved better.
Being a black man in America, you know, police has always profiled us and, you know, always put us over for just suspicions and things like that. So this just kind of put a hiring sign to America of what we go through on an everyday basis in our own community, being policed by people outside of our own community.
There's a growing understanding that this is not just a rare and idiosyncratic thing, that we have a systemic problem in this country of excess use of force, and each individual video or each individual incident might have its own particularities, but I think the public is beginning to appreciate that there's a pattern, and that pattern reveals something that many in Black America understood, but may not have been as visible to much of non-Black America.
You keep fighting for me.
the following weeks, protests would be held regularly across the globe. Polls suggest that between 15 and 26 million people in the U.S. alone attended at least one protest or rally in June of 2020, which is estimated to be one of the largest protest movements in U.S. history.
We'd been seeing a series of incidents building, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others that were gaining attention. In a way, the video of George Floyd was the straw that broke the camel's back. And then I suspect the fact that this was happening in the midst of the COVID crisis meant that there was just ways in which more people could pay attention, more people could be mobilized, and all of that played a role in allowing this one moment to really capture the attention of the nation.
Polls suggest that 84% of American adults were following news about the protests at least fairly closely at the beginning of June. Terms like Black Lives Matter, police reform, protests, and even broader terms like police were searched on Google more in June 2020 than at any other point in Google's history.
A key strategy of the civil rights activists in the late 1950s and early 60s was to organize protests so that they could be documented by TV news crews as a way to move public opinion and force change. In the 1960s, they needed NBC or ABC or CBS to come with big cameras and document those protests, and now individual activists with just a smartphone can try to document state violence on their own. We saw a lot of attention by the press to these issues of police violence, concerns about racial injustice, also a focus on violence at protests. The movement was very effective at basically putting police reform on the national agenda.
A year after Floyd's death, the debate over how policing should look in America remains a prevalent and unresolved issue.
One of the biggest obstacles is that people just can't agree on what role they would like the police department to play in their community. And so in the end, as the months pass, there isn't really a lot of firm sort of changes that you can put your hands on, but we have seen small incremental changes. The Minneapolis Police Department and at police departments in various parts of the country where they're working on banning chokeholds like the one we saw George Floyd undergo. They're working on different plans of de-escalation.
There are a number of ways reform has happened in the past. Probably the most important one in recent history was federal legislation that allowed the federal government to investigate local police forces and then negotiate consent decrees if they find that there are significant rights violations in those police forces. That comes out of the wave of violent protest in Los Angeles in 1992 that follows the acquittal of 4 officers who were caught on camera beating Rodney King. There's a long black freedom struggle that is building up to moments like the March on Washington, where within a year of the March on Washington, we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Within a year of the marches in Selma, Alabama for voting rights, we get the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So on the one hand, there is this kind of short window between when the nation says this is urgent and legislation gets passed, but it's also important to see that there are these long-run, slow-moving processes as well that are creating the preconditions for that change.
The common cry among protesters was to defund or abolish the police. Some cities like Austin, Minneapolis, and Seattle voted in 2020 to reallocate funds from police departments to other services like housing and mental health assistance. But creating a blanket blueprint for reforming a department that will work in every city is difficult.
You have to remember, there are some 18,000 small municipalities, different jurisdictions across the country when it comes to police departments. And so finding an agreement in that at a local level, at a federal level, it becomes a very, very complicated issue.
When you reallocate funding from one to another, it has to be ensured that it works, that you have some kind of model that you can adapt to. And therein lies the tough part of scripting crime strategies, being less invasive, more responsible, more transparent, and yet maintaining public order.
As of May 20th, 2021, 40 states enacted significant legislation around policing policy in the last year. Of those, 17 enacted legislation addressing the use of neck restraints like the one used on George Floyd. More states have policing legislation pending. But federal legislation has been more slow-moving. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act was introduced just over a week after Floyd's death, but has been revised in the last year and is still awaiting passage in the Senate.
I will tell you that over the last 50 years, members of the Congressional Black Caucus every single year have attempted to introduce and pass legislation related to policing and did not succeed. And the key ingredient that was different this time was the massive movement that took place in every single state. And so the goal is, how do we prevent these type of incidences from occurring? What will bring about a fundamental change? And the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is a very serious first step in that direction. The goal is to stop chokeholds, to stop no-knock warrants, to end qualified immunity, to be able to prosecute officers. So the goal is to change the culture of policing in the United States.
The act is one of the most sweeping bills regulating police at a federal level, but there is still criticism from police and protesters.
I believe that the protests did shift something, but politically and legislatively, I feel like we're definitely falling short. The culture of policing is inherently violent, and no matter how many good people go into this system trying to change it, the system itself is broken. You cannot train brutality out of American policing.
You're putting in the head of police officers that they won't be backed up by their city when they're compelled to take action. They're not doing it to further themselves personally. They're doing so in a fashion to help the city out, to help that person to resolve, to mitigate any issue that comes forward.
The number of protests and amount of coverage declined over time, but the impact of Floyd's death and the movement that followed will likely be felt for years.
What I am very encouraged by is that although it is not in the headlines with hundreds of thousands of people out in the street, it is still very much viewed as an absolutely important issue in this House, both in the House, in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans. So we are not walking away from this issue.
For a generation of young people who came of age in the last few years, this has been a defining issue of their coming to political consciousness. And I think we will see the ripple effects of that over many years to come.
Well, a saying that always sticks with me is, in decades nothing can change, but in weeks we can change decades. I don't want to see another mass mobilization in the streets, only because it probably means that another black person died. But I do want to see another mass mobilization of people holding their elected officials accountable. I want to see a mass mobilization of people actually helping each other in our communities.
As a community, we would like to see change. We would like to see people in our community police their own community.
It's always hard to predict what history is going to think of something 20 years from now or 50 years from now. But the one thing that seems clear right now is that this was a moment when America, people of all colors, said enough is enough, and we have to change the way we operate.